Yasher Koach to both of you, Abby and Benny. That was really beautiful, really important Torah that you both shared with us. And Benny, I think you're right. A few days ago, the Park Slope Patch reported that a full 50% of this neighborhood is at least partially vaccinated. And CBE now has a reopening task force that is making plans for how and when and with what precautions we will reopen services and programs to members in person. We're all pretty eager to do the things we couldn't do for the last 13 months. But will everything go back to quote unquote normal? Will life be like it was before? It seems every day there are new predictions about how this pandemic will have changed us. Will we have trouble making eye contact because we're so used to seeing each other over Zoom? Will our work look different with more people staying home for work? Will we travel less for business or for conferences? In the context of late pandemic, this week's double portion seems to be telling us that those are the wrong set of questions, or they're at least missing something more important. Rather than wonder how we are different now, perhaps we ought to be asking how we want to be different now. Benny, you pointed out that the ritual after a Metzora is declared pure gives both the person who's been sick and the community confidence that re-entry is safe, much like a vaccine card will do. When the priest puts blood on the Metzora's right ear, right thumb, and right big toe, this was a sign of protection and safety, because for the ancient Israelites, blood was an apotropaic substance, meaning it would guard you and keep you safe, they believed. So it makes sense that the priest would smear blood on the edges of the person's body to ward off any harm that might come to them or from them. But what about the oil? Why the oil? It turns out that the ritual of smearing blood and oil on the right ear, the right thumb, and the right big toe is identical to the ritual that was performed at the ordination of the priests. In other words, the Metzora, the person who just a few weeks earlier had to walk through the camp declaring loudly unclean, that they were unclean, the person who was quarantined outside the camp is now not just welcomed back, but treated like the high priest, the highest ranking person in the society. And as you mentioned, oil is placed over the blood on the right ear, the right thumb, and the right big toe, and then the remaining oil is poured over the head of the Metzora. When used in ritual in the ancient Near East, oil represented elevation of status in the society. In fact, the word Messiah, Mashiach in Hebrew, it means anointed one, as in the one who had oil poured on them. In case you don't know it, the Mashiach is theoretically the person we're all waiting for, the descendant of King David, who our tradition says will one day bring about God's world on earth, a world characterized by justice and peace. When kings were anointed in ancient Israel, they were understood to have the ruach, or the spirit of Yud-He Vav-He, Adonai, placed upon them. It was a kind of absorption of divine qualities by the leader. And when the high priest was anointed with oil, it set the priest apart from the profane and ordinary aspects of life. The word kadosh was used to describe that moment, meaning that the oil sanctified the priest, enabling him to come in contact with the holy objects of the tabernacle that were otherwise dangerous to people. What does it mean to be sanctified or made holy? In the very next portions of Torah, Acharei Mot and Kiddushim, we read the Holiness Code, which was the priestly document that's at the center of the Torah, in which the meaning of holiness is set out. Be holy, for I, Adonai, your God, am holy, the Torah says. Holiness has to do with imitation of God. Holiness is aspirational for human beings. It is the attempt to become more godly. While there are ritual aspects to the Holiness Code, and there are also sections related to family relations and sexual conduct, most of the code is about how people treat one another in a society. Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself, is here in the Holiness Code. Do not hate your kinsfolk in your heart. Do not take vengeance or bear a grudge. Do not steal. Do not defraud. Do not render unfair decisions. Do not deal falsely with each other. When you harvest your field, do not reap all the way to the edges, but leave food for the poor and the stranger. Do not wrong a stranger. Love the stranger as yourself, for you were strangers. Holiness is aspiration to be godly in the way we treat one another in a society. So why would the Metzora undergo a ritual like this, identical to the one of the high priest, in which the holiness is the goal? So the priest's role is to care for the community as a whole, and they attend to those in particular at the edges of the camp, such as the Metzora. They make peace between those who are quarreling and might feel alienated from the group. They facilitate a process by which those who've done wrong and those who feel that they have sinned and would feel excluded for that reason, they facilitate a process by which those people can receive forgiveness and draw near to God again. Now, Abby, you taught us so very beautifully today about women's awesome life-giving power in relation to and in contrast with death and mortality. And you suggested that perhaps a new mother's quarantine was less about a punishment related to uncleanness and more a cocoon of time, buffering the tender and transformational experience of childbirth from the rough forces of the everyday. And you reflected that this year has been so for each of us, an opportunity for time away from the ordinary rush of life. This is, I think, something of a secret that many of us have been whispering to one another all year long, that in the midst of the terrible tragedy of this pandemic, there was also an experience of rest, of needed quiet and inwardness, of reflection and insight and perspective and distance. Perhaps the experience of quarantine, whether after the birth of a child or during a plague, is a sensitization process, giving the isolated person or people a new perspective from a bit of distance. From the experience of isolation, we gain a distance like the perspective of the divine itself. Perhaps the returning Metzora in ancient Israel had new wisdom and new insights to offer from that experience. Perhaps in the ritual of elevation, in the imitation of the priests and of God, there was an opportunity to be aspirational anew about their own lives and about the society as a whole. If we are like the Metzora right now, what did we see with new eyes during our quarantine that causes us to emerge from this time with new and deeper aspirations for our lives and for our society? If we are on the cusp of re-entry right now, in what ways do we want to be different this time around? In what ways do we not want to simply go back to the way things were? I would suggest 3 societal insights from this period of pandemic that we must bring with us into our new future. First, thinking about your Devar Torah, Abby, we saw structured gender inequality this year. We already knew that women's unpaid labor makes the world go round, but during the pandemic, it was glaring. Every parent was stressed, but it was generally moms who were losing it, as a higher percentage of homemaking and cooking and childcare often falls to them in many homes. And without the outsourcing of those functions, women with children were in an impossible bind. More than 2 million women left the workforce in 2020, crying out for structural change and relief. Second, we saw the value of essential workers. In New York, we cheered for them for a while there, every night at 7. It became clear to us that many of the lowest paid jobs in our society are the jobs we rely on the most, that we cannot function without. Childcare workers, teachers, nurses, hospital orderlies, janitors, delivery workers. This has the potential to change our attitude toward organized labor and our valuation of what are currently the lowest paid jobs in our country. Number 3, we saw white supremacy and systemic racism more clearly this year than many of us had ever seen it before. Some of us had seen it clearly all along, but some of us had our eyes opened in a new and different way. We saw the pandemic sicken and kill Black and brown people disproportionately. And we saw Derek Chauvin snuff out the life of George Floyd. We filled the streets in an unprecedented way, demanding systemic change in the catastrophic policing system. But since then, the killing has not stopped. This week, just this week, 20-year-old dad, Dante Wright, was killed just minutes from where Derek Chauvin's on trial in a town that bears our name, Brooklyn Center. And 13-year-old Adam Toledo was killed in Chicago this week. 13 years old, 7th grade. That is your age, Abby and Benny. That is your age. Think about how your whole life is ahead of you right now. Think about that tragedy. We decided this year to never let this be normal again, and now it is upon us. Going forward, we must make that commitment real. So as the world opens up, there will be pressure to slide right back into old patterns, to re-embrace life as it was, and we are craving life as it was in many ways. But none of us has to succumb to that pressure, because each of us has the ability to articulate our aspirations for our own futures and the future of our society. We saw differently this year. We learned deeply. We reevaluated what mattered most in our lives and in our country. And now is the time to decide who we want to be. We can aspire to holiness, to godliness, to a new and different future for ourselves and for our society. Can you hear that song?